So Saussure ended on a not totally brilliantly 100% clear kind of note. And there were some questions that were left up in the air. And Emily, not me, class Emily, summarized them for me and sent me a message asking me to, since I had said I was making a video, address these issues. So we all owe her a debt of gratitude, or at least we do if I manage to address the issues. Okay, I'm going to try to do this as in order and reasonably as possible. Reasonably meaning in a rational order as possible. Okay, and I'm going to start by talking about what most people sort of understood by the end of class, which is how signs touch the world. And the easiest way, I think, to imagine this is to think about empiricism. This has occurred to me in retrospect as maybe a good example, that when we say something when I say something touches the world, what I mean is I can use language to describe something that actually happens in the world. So I can write a lab report and it is true. Poems or whatever like that, we can leave that to the side for a second. But if I write a lab report, the words that I'm using touch the data. They actually refer to the data. So I've made a drawing. Is it upside down? No, it's perfect. Okay, so the signs that I've drawn are purple and blue, and that means nothing except that the purple marker was bugging me, so I replaced it with the blue one. The things down on the bottom that are green, those are meant to be just things in the world, like data or a table or my dead cat Lucy, or the idea of empiricism itself. And actually, I'm going to need another marker. Hold on. Let's see. That one won't work well. I'm so excited to choose from different colors. Okay, this one might work. When we get to post-structuralism, which I hate to introduce now, but I'm going to anyway because it's a good contrast, post-structuralists are eventually going to say, signifiers just only point to each other. We never get out of this. Post-structuralists are going to say, we're just always only ever in signs. Those green things down there, you just made those up. Okay, we're not talking about that right now. When I say touch the world, or when I say point, or when Saussure says point to things, he means, and I mean, that this sign right here actually really, gosh, let me make it, describes this thing, points to this thing. It doesn't just point to this other signify sign that it doesn't have some floppy meaning that just refers to some other floppy meaning sign. It actually describes the data or a table or whatever. And all these signs can actually, and whatever the green thing is, we might argue about that, and how to use the sign, we might argue about that also. But fundamentally, oh dear, fundamentally, we believe that the signs point to, describe touch, refer to things that we can see or conceive of or imagine. I guess it's the same thing as conceive of. And that we're not just lost in a mass of signifiers and signifieds, but that we're actually describing the real world when we use language. Okay, I hope that's clear, and I think it's the most important thing that, if it wasn't clear before, is clear now. That language actually refers to things in the world. This seems like common sense, so I'm hoping that the reason it's difficult to understand is just that it seems like common sense, and so when I say it, you, I hope, are thinking like something like I must not understand, because that's just, of course, what language does. Maybe. Okay. To value. I'm already at 7 minutes. Oh, I'm so sorry. To value. Okay. If I have a dime, I can exchange it for 10 pennies. I can, exchange is the wrong word. If I have a dime, that's the same, that's worth 10 pennies. That's like signification. If I have a dime, I can exchange it for a piece of gum. That's like value. Okay. Value is made up of syntagmatic relations and associative relations. So all of the things that we said about how syntagmatic relations, like we sat on the bank of the river, or associative relations like bank reminds me of safety or insecurity or robbery or whatever. All of those things make up the value of a sign. So another way to think of value, and I hate to use this word because it's misleading, but if you need a word, you might just use meaning. As long as you understood meaning to be in the context of other words, like in a sentence, and meaning to be like ideas about the word that you have independent of where it falls in a sentence, but just when you hear it. Okay, I'm checking things off here once I've mentioned them. Okay. The value inheres in how the sign can be used. It's not but it's not inherent to the sign. It has to do with its use. The sign is arbitrary. Once we start using it, it acquires meaning, which is another way, I think, of saying that another way of going back to the way in which language is differential and described only negatively, but signs can, in their totality, can be described in positive terms. That's almost a quotation. And that's because signs are operating in opposition to each other. So there's a way in which it makes sense to differentiate cow and beef as signs, for example. And then there's another way to say that chicken just means something in its own right. And when a sign acquires meaning or value, it makes more sense to talk about it in positive terms. So when I talk about bank as being, we sat on the bank of the river, or when I talk about bank as reminding me of security or insecurity of robbery, then I'm talking about bank as if it means something. And at that point, it's easiest, more honest. It's more honest to think of it as having a positive meaning when it's used. Okay. Let's see. Another way of thinking about this is, again, to think about it in terms of empiricism. If I say cellular, and I mean that to describe an actual thing, then I mean it in a positive way, which is to say, I mean it not just differentially. I mean cellular versus cell versus cellulose. I don't know what I'm talking about. But I mean it to describe positively something cellular. That's how it would relate to empiricism. Again, we might think about this as the way in which words mean things in a structuralist point of view instead of just floating around. So this was my chart on my chalkboard at the beginning. Okay. These questions are more specific, so they might not be your questions, but they did come up. Latin and Greek roots on either the root of the word or an affix has to do, perhaps, I'm kind of making this up, with signs collapsing into each other, so that a signifier and a signifier and a signifier bring three signifieds together when we use them as one sign. These aren't particularly interesting examples linguistically, but if we think of weekend or suitcase, we see the same thing, that there are two signs that when they collapse become a different sign. Okay, I think that's clear enough. It's the suit and case are arbitrary, but when I put them together into one word, it's still an arbitrary sign. It's just that I've collapsed these two other signs that are conventionally meaningful. In that way, it's just like putting a sentence together. So I packed my suit in a case. I packed my suitcase. I've collapsed two of the words, but the word itself, the sign, forgive me, I've collapsed two of the signs. The sign itself is still arbitrary. It has things in it that are meaningful independent of that sign. They're meaningful in other signs, but the value just changes because I've collapsed them. Okay, one last question, and this was thrown in at the end, but there is one system, according to Saussure, for language. So when I talk, for example, to a 3-year-old, I speak really, really differently than I would do when I talk to you, than I do when I talk to you. But that's because I am introducing the 3-year-old very slowly to the system, the structure, the long of language. It's not because there's a different system or structure or long. It's because I want to pick out the rules that I want to emphasize most. So if I said to you something like, yeah, I caught the ball and it hurt my arm, so it was going super fast, I might say to a 3-year-old, Mommy hurt arm, catch ball. That's not a different system. That's just me trying to emphasize certain rules. So long, that's an example of parole that doesn't necessarily match up with the way I would speak to you, but it's still in fact, a really good example of teaching language, teaching long. This is 15 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. If I haven't answered your questions, keep them to yourself. I can't do another one of these. Just kidding. You should let me know what they are. Okay. Okay. I'll see you when I see you.